Picture this. You're standing in the shadows of marble columns, watching as servants drag another screaming victim toward the imperial throne. The year is 192 AD, and the man seated before you, draped in silk and gold, is no ordinary ruler. He believes himself to be the reincarnation of Hercules, demands to fight wild beasts in the arena, and has transformed the sacred act of governance into the most twisted theatre of cruelty the Roman Empire has ever witnessed. Your hands tremble as you watch Emperor Commodus stroke the blade of his gladius, while casually discussing which senator's wife should be forced to watch her husband's execution. The marble floors beneath your sandals are stained with the blood of those who dared question his divine authority, and you realize you're witnessing the reign of a monarch, and who discovered that absolute power doesn't corrupt gradually. Sometimes it explodes all at once, turning pleasure into public torture and transforming an empire into one man's personal playground of sadistic entertainment. Before diving into this forgotten tale of imperial madness and systematic brutality, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the darkest chapters of human nature. The man who would become Rome's most sadistic emperor was born Lucius Aurelius Commodus on August 31st, 161 AD, into a world of unimaginable privilege and expectation. His father, Marcus Aurelius, was the philosopher emperor whose meditations on virtue and duty would inspire leaders for millennia. But destiny has a cruel sense of irony, and the son of Rome's most thoughtful ruler would become its most thoughtless monster. From his earliest years, Commodus existed in a bubble of absolute indulgence, where every whim was satisfied and every desire fulfilled without question or consequence. Palace servants competed to anticipate his needs before he even expressed them, creating a reality where the word no simply didn't exist in his vocabulary. The seeds of his future cruelty were planted in the luxurious gardens of imperial privilege, watered by the constant flattery of courtiers who understood that their survival depended on feeding the young prince's growing ego. Unlike other Roman nobles who were sent to study rhetoric, philosophy, and military strategy, Commodus was raised like a pampered pet, entertained by gladiatorial exhibitions, exotic animal hunts, and theatrical performances that glorified violence as the highest form of art. His tutors, handpicked for their willingness to indulge rather than educate, taught him that emperors were living gods whose pleasure was the only moral law that mattered. When Marcus Aurelius died in 180 AD, the 20-year-old Commodus inherited not just an empire, but the accumulated expectations of a civilization that believed their golden age would continue under his enlightened leadership. The contrast between father and son was immediate and devastating. Where Marcus Aurelius had spent his reign defending Rome's borders and contemplating the nature of justice, Commodus spent his first months as emperor planning increasingly elaborate entertainments that would showcase his divine status to a world he viewed as his personal audience. The transformation began subtly with what appeared to be harmless indulgences in imperial luxury. Commodus expanded the gladiatorial games, increased the frequency of public executions, and began appearing personally in the arena to demonstrate his prowess as a warrior. To the Roman people, these might have seemed like generous gifts from a young emperor eager to please his subjects. But those closest to the imperial court recognized something far more sinister developing behind the emperor's pale blue eyes. The same courtiers who had spent years feeding his childhood fantasies now found themselves trapped in a nightmare of their own creation. The emperor's understanding of pleasure became fundamentally twisted during his early months of absolute power. Traditional Roman emperors might enjoy gladiatorial games as political theatre or military spectacle, but Commodus discovered that his greatest satisfaction came not from watching violence, but from witnessing the fear and humiliation of those who had no choice but to participate in his increasingly elaborate scenarios. He began requiring senators to attend private exhibitions in the imperial palace, where condemned criminals would be forced to fight wild animals, while the emperor provided running commentary on their terror and suffering. These private entertainments revealed the psychological foundation of Commodus's cruelty. He seemed incapable of experiencing pleasure without an audience to his dominance, and incapable of feeling powerful without reducing others to complete helplessness. The young emperor would position himself on an elevated throne during these spectacles, dressed in the lion skin of Hercules, while forcing Rome's most distinguished citizens to watch as human beings were torn apart by starving beasts. But the true horror lay not in the violence itself, but in Commodus's obvious sexual arousal during these exhibitions, and his insistence that his audience share in his excitement. The emperor's appetite for combining pleasure with public humiliation expanded rapidly beyond the confines of the palace. He began staging elaborate public ceremonies that blurred the lines between religious ritual, political theatre, and sadistic entertainment. During one documented festival in 182 AD, Commodus ordered the construction of a temporary amphitheatre in the Forum Romanum, where he forced the wives and daughters of prominent senators to participate in mock gladiatorial combat, while their male relatives were compelled to cheer for their favourites. The emperor watched from his golden throne, masturbating openly while providing detailed commentary on the women's terror and physical vulnerability. These public humiliations served multiple purposes in Commodus's psychological landscape. They demonstrated his absolute power over Rome's elite families, provided him with sexual satisfaction that seemed to require public witnessing, and created a network of compromised observers, whose shared shame bound them to his service through mutual degradation. The emperor understood that people who had been forced to watch their loved ones humiliated were unlikely to rebel against him, since their own complicity made them vulnerable to exposure and retribution. The spatial organization of these entertainments reflected Commodus's need to transform all of Rome into extensions of his private appetites. He commissioned extensive modifications to existing amphitheatres, creating viewing boxes positioned at precise angles to maximize his visual access to both the violence in the arena and the reactions of spectators forced to witness it. Traditional gladiatorial games had been designed to entertain the masses while demonstrating imperial power, but Commodus's innovations turned these spectacles into elaborate psychological experiments designed to explore the boundaries between pleasure and terror. His relationship with the gladiators themselves revealed another dimension of his twisted understanding of power and sexuality. Unlike previous emperors, who maintained formal distance from arena fighters, Commodus regularly invited successful gladiators to private dinners in the imperial palace, where they would be required to perform not just as warriors, but as sexual partners in scenarios that combined combat training with intimate domination. These men, chosen for their physical strength and fighting skill, found themselves trapped in a world where their survival depended on satisfying the emperor's increasingly complex appetites. The emperor's favourite gladiator, a Germanic prisoner named Narcissus, occupied a unique position in this hierarchy of imperial pleasure. Contemporary sources describe elaborate ceremonies where Commodus would require Narcissus to defeat multiple opponents, while the emperor watched from positions that allowed him to observe every detail of the combat. These private exhibitions would conclude with sexual encounters between the emperor and the victorious gladiator, apparently conducted in full view of the defeated fighters who had been left wounded but alive specifically to serve as witnesses to their emperor's divine virility. But Commodus's innovation lay not just in the combination of violence and sexuality, but in his systematic transformation of traditional Roman institutions into vehicles for his personal gratification. The Senate, once the cornerstone of Roman republican virtue, became a theatre where political debate was replaced by elaborate humiliation rituals designed to satisfy the emperor's need for absolute submission. Senators arriving for what they believed would be routine legislative sessions might find themselves required to participate in mock trials where their colleagues were condemned to death for entertainment value, or forced to vote on resolutions that served no purpose except to demonstrate their complete powerlessness. The emperor's treatment of religious ceremonies demonstrated how thoroughly he had integrated his personal appetites into every aspect of Roman public life. Traditional festivals honoring the gods were transformed into elaborate exhibitions of imperial divinity, where Commodus would appear dressed as various deities while requiring citizens to worship him through acts that combined religious devotion with sexual service. During the festival of Saturnalia in 183 AD, the emperor ordered the construction of a massive temple complex, where traditional religious ceremonies were replaced with worship services centered around his physical performance as the reincarnated Hercules. These religious innovations reflected Commodus's apparent belief that his divine status granted him unlimited authority over the most intimate aspects of his subjects' lives. He seemed convinced that his ability to compel others to engage in degrading acts demonstrated his godlike power over human nature itself. Traditional gods might control natural forces or influence human destiny, but only a true divinity could command absolute submission in the realm of physical and sexual behavior, transforming worship from spiritual contemplation into bodily surrender. The economic dimensions of these spectacles created additional layers of control over Roman society. Beyond the immediate humiliation of forced participation, the emperor regularly demanded enormous financial contributions to fund his increasingly elaborate productions. Wealthy families found themselves bankrupted not only by traditional taxes, but also by the costs of constructing specialized venues, purchasing exotic animals and props, and maintaining the emperor's growing collection of gladiators, dancers, and other performers used in his exhibitions. The systematic nature of this financial extortion revealed the calculating intelligence beneath Commodus's apparent madness. Senator Gaius Scribonius documented spending the equivalent of 3 years' income on a single evening's entertainment, where his daughter was forced to dance naked before a collection of wild leopards, while the emperor directed her movements from his elevated throne. The elaborate staging required the construction of specialized platforms, the purchase of exotic costumes that would tear easily under the animal's claws, and payments to trainers who could ensure the beasts would terrify without immediately killing their human prey. These economic pressures reinforced the psychological control achieved through public humiliation. Families who had been financially ruined by the emperor's demands found themselves completely dependent on his continued favor for their basic survival. The traditional Roman patronage system, where wealthy citizens supported artists and philosophers, was perverted into a network of mutual degradation, where survival required active participation in increasingly elaborate scenarios of imperial pleasure. The emperor's understanding of fear as an aphrodisiac led him to develop increasingly sophisticated methods of psychological manipulation. He discovered that anticipation of violence often provided him with greater sexual satisfaction than the violence itself. Commodus would spend weeks planning elaborate scenarios where condemned prisoners would be given false hope of escape or reprieve, only to have these hopes systematically destroyed in front of audiences who had been carefully selected for their emotional investment in the victim's fate. One documented case involved Senator Marcus Junius Brutus, accused of conspiracy in 184 AD. Rather than the traditional execution that would have ended his suffering quickly, Commodus ordered an elaborate month-long process where Brutus was forced to participate in increasingly degrading competitions for the emperor's amusement. Each day brought new humiliations designed to strip away another layer of the senator's dignity, while providing Commodus with fresh opportunities to experience arousal through the witnessing of complete psychological destruction. The emperor's palace became a laboratory for exploring the relationship between power, pleasure, and human suffering. He commissioned detailed architectural modifications that allowed him to observe his victims from multiple angles while remaining partially concealed, creating an environment where the watched never knew exactly when they were being observed. Secret passages and hidden viewing chambers were constructed throughout the imperial complex, enabling Commodus to appear suddenly during private moments when his subjects believed themselves unobserved. These voyeuristic innovations extended to his treatment of his own guards and servants. The Praetorian Guard, traditionally the emperor's most trusted protectors, found themselves subjected to elaborate tests of loyalty that combined professional duty with sexual submission. Guards who had sworn to defend the emperor with their lives discovered that their oath now included requirements to participate in or witness acts that violated every principle of Roman military honor. Centurion Cassius Dio, who would later chronicle these events, described rituals where guards were required to maintain perfect military discipline, while the emperor engaged in sexual acts mere feet away from their posts. These exhibitions served to demonstrate Commodus's power over men trained for violence while simultaneously providing him with the audience his appetites seemed to require. The psychological pressure of maintaining professional composure while witnessing behavior they found revolting created a form of mental torture that complemented the physical violence occurring throughout the palace. See, the madness finally ended on December 31st, 1920 AD, when Narcissus, the very gladiator who had been forced to witness and participate in so many of the emperor's twisted pleasures, strangled Commodus in his bath. The conspirators understood that only complete destruction could cleanse Rome of what they had created through years of indulgence and complicity. As we step back from those blood-stained marble corridors where screams once echoed and dignity died, we're reminded that absolute power doesn't just corrupt the ruler, it transforms entire civilizations into stages for human cruelty. Commodus proved that when pleasure becomes inseparable from domination, when entertainment requires the destruction of others, empires don't just fall, they devour themselves from within, leaving only ruins and the whispered warnings of history.